Tonio Kröger, Part 1. The winter sun was no more than a feeble gleam, milky and wan behind the layers of cloud above the narrow streets of the town. Down among the gabled houses it was damp and draughty, with occasional showers of a kind of soft hail that was neither ice nor snow. School was over. The hosts of liberated pupils streamed across the paved yard and out through the latticed gate, where they divided and hastened off in opposite directions. The tall ones held their bundles of books in a dignified manner, high up against their left shoulders, and with their right arms to windward steered their course toward dinner. The little ones trotted merrily off with their feet splashing in the icy slush and the paraphernalia of learning rattling about in their sealskin satchels. But now and then they would one and all snatch off their caps with an air of pious awe as some senior master with a beard of Jove and the hat of Wotan strode solemnly by. "Are you coming now, Hans?" said Tonio Kröger. He had been waiting in the street for some time. With a smile he approached his friend, who had just emerged from the gate, chattering to some other boys and about to move off with them. "What?" he asked, looking at Tonio. "Oh yes, of course. We're going for a bit of a walk." Tonio did not speak, and his eyes clouded over with sadness. Had Hans forgotten? Had he only just remembered that they had arranged to walk home together this afternoon? And he himself, ever since Hans had promised to come, had been almost continuously looking forward to it. "Well, so long, you fellows," said Hans Hansen to his companions. "I'm going for a bit of a walk now with Kröger," and the two of them turned to the left, while the others sauntered off to the right. Hans and Tonio had time to take a walk after school, because they both came from families in which dinner was not served until 4 o'clock. Their fathers were important men of business, who held public office in the town and wielded considerable influence. The Hansens had for many generations owned the large timber yards down by the river, where powerful mechanical saws hissed and spat as they cut up the tree trunks. But Tonio was the son of Consul Kröger, whose sacks of grain could be seen any day being driven through the streets, with his firm's name stamped on them in great black letters, and his spacious old ancestral house was the stateliest in the whole town. The two friends were constantly having to doff their caps to their numerous acquaintances. Indeed, although they were only 14, many of those they met were the first to greet them. Both had slung their satchels across their shoulders, and both were well and warmly dressed. Hans in a short pilot jacket with the broad blue collar of a sailor suit hanging out over his back, and Tonio in a grey belted overcoat. Hans wore a Danish sailor cap with black ribbons, and a shock of his flaxen blonde hair stood out from under it. He was extraordinarily good-looking and well-built, broad in the shoulders and narrow in the hips, with keen steely blue eyes set wide apart. But Tonio's complexion, under his round fur cap, was swarthy. His features were sharply cut and quite southern in character, and the look in his dark, heavy-lidded eyes, ringed with delicate shadows, was dreamy and a little hesitant. The outlines of his mouth and chin were unusually soft. His gait was nonchalant and unsteady, whereas Hans's slender black-stockinged legs moved with a springy and rhythmic step. Tonio was walking in silence. He was suffering. He had drawn his rather slanting brows together and rounded his lips as if to whistle, and was gazing into vacancy with his head tilted to one side. This attitude and facial expression were characteristic of him. Suddenly, Hans pushed his arm under Tonio's with a sidelong glance at him, for he understood very well what was the matter, and although Tonio still did not speak during the next few steps, he suddenly felt very moved. "I hadn't forgotten, you know, Tonio," said Hans, gazing down at the sidewalk. "I just thought we probably wouldn't be having a walk after all today, because it's so wet and windy. But I don't mind the weather, of course, and I think it's marvelous of you to have waited for me all the same. I'd already decided you must have gone home, and I was feeling cross." Everything in Tonio began to dance with joy at these words. "Well, then, let's go round along the promenade," he said, in a voice full of emotion. "Along the Mühlenwall and the Holstenwall, and I'll take us as far as your house, Hans." "Oh, of course not. It doesn't matter. I don't mind walking home by myself afterward. You can walk me home next time." In his heart, he was not really convinced by what Hans had said, and sensed very clearly that his friend attached only half as much importance as he did to this tete-a-tete walk. But he perceived nevertheless that Hans was sorry for his forgetfulness, and was going out of his way to conciliate him. Antonio was very far from wishing to resist these conciliatory advances. The fact was that Tonio loved Hans Hansen, and had already suffered a great deal on his account. Whoever loves the more is at a disadvantage and must suffer. Life had already imparted this hard and simple truth to his 14-year-old soul. And his nature was such that when he learned something in this way, he took careful note of it, inwardly writing it down, so to speak, and even taking a certain pleasure in it, though without, of course, modifying his own behavior in the light of it, or turning it to any practical account. He had, moreover, the kind of mind that found such lessons much more important and interesting than any of the knowledge that was thrust down his throat at school. Indeed, as he sat through the hours of instruction in the vaulted Gothic classrooms, he would chiefly be occupied in savouring these insights to their very depths, and thinking out all their implications. And this pastime would give him just the same sort of satisfaction as he felt when he wandered round his own room with his violin, for he played the violin, and drew from it notes of such tenderness as only he could draw, notes which he mingled with the rippling sound of the fountain down in the garden as it leaped and danced under the branches of the old walnut tree. The fountain, the old walnut tree, his violin, and the sea in the distance, the Baltic Sea to whose summer reveries he could listen when he visited it in the holidays. These were the things he loved, the things which, so to speak, he arranged around himself and among which his inner life evolved. Things with names that may be employed in poetry to good effect, and which did, indeed, very frequently recur in the poems that Tonio Kröger from time to time composed. The fact that he possessed a notebook full of poems written by himself had by his own fault become public knowledge, and it very adversely affected his reputation both with his schoolmates and with the masters. Consul Kröger's son, on the one hand, thought their disapproval stupid and contemptible, and consequently despised his fellow pupils as well as his teachers, whose ill-bred behavior, in any case, disgusted him, and whose personal weaknesses had not escaped his uncommonly penetrating eye. But, on the other hand, he himself felt that there was something extravagant and really improper about writing poetry, and in a certain sense he could not help agreeing with all those who considered it a very odd occupation. Nevertheless, this did not prevent him from continuing to write. Since he frittered away his time at home, and was lethargic and inattentive in class, and out of favour with the masters, he continually brought back absolutely wretched reports, to the great annoyance and distress of his father, a tall, carefully dressed man with pensive blue eyes, who always wore a wild flower in his buttonhole. To Tonio's mother, however, his beautiful dark-haired mother, whose first name was Consuelo, and who was in every way so unlike the other ladies of that town, his father having in days gone by fetched her up as his bride-to-be from somewhere right at the bottom of the map, to his mother these school reports did not matter in the least. Tonio loved his dark, fiery mother, who played the piano and the mandolin so enchantingly, and he was glad that his dubious standing in human society did not grieve her. But, on the other hand, he felt that his father's anger was much more dignified and comme il faut, and though scolded by him, he basically agreed with his father's view of the matter, and found his mother's blithe unconcern slightly disreputable. Often his thoughts would run rather like this: "It's quite enough that I should be as I am, and that I will not and cannot change. Heedless and intractable, and with my mind full of things no one else thinks about. It's at least only right and proper that I should be seriously scolded and punished for it, instead of having it all glossed over with kisses and music. After all, we're not gypsies in a green caravan, but respectable people, the Krögers, Consul Kröger's family. And occasionally he would reflect, but why is it that I am peculiar? Why do I fight against everything? Why am I in the master's bad books and a stranger among the other boys? Just look at them, the good pupils and the solid mediocre ones. They don't find the masters ridiculous, they don't write poetry, and they only think the kind of thoughts that one does and should think, the kind that can be spoken aloud. How decent they must feel, how at peace with everything and everyone. It must be good to be like that. But what is the matter with me, and what will come of it all? This manner of reflecting upon himself and upon his position in life was an important factor in Tonio's love for Hans Hansen. He loved him firstly because he was beautiful, but secondly because he saw him as his own counterpart and opposite in all respects. Hans Hansen was an outstanding pupil, as well as being a fine fellow, a first-class rider and athlete and swimmer who enjoyed universal popularity. The masters almost doted on him, called him by his first name, and promoted his interests in every way. His schoolmates vied for his favor. Ladies and gentlemen stopped him in the street, seized him by the shock of flaxen blonde hair that stood out from under his Danish sailor cap, and said, "Good morning, Hans Hansen, with your nice head of hair. Still top of the class? That's a fine lad. Remember me to your father and mother." Such was Hans Hansen, and ever since they had first met, the very sight of him had filled Tonio Kröger with longing, an envious longing which he could feel as a burning sensation in his chest. If only one could have blue eyes like yours, he thought. If only one could live so normally and in such happy harmony with all the world as you do. You are always doing something suitable, something that everyone respects. When you have finished your school tasks, you take writing lessons or work at things with your fretzo. And even when you go down to the sea in the holidays, you are busy rowing and sailing and swimming, while I lie idly and forlornly in the sand, staring at the face of the sea and in its mysterious expressions that change so quickly. But that is why your eyes are so clear. If only I could be like you. He made no attempt to become like Hans Hansen. Indeed, his wish to be like him was perhaps even hardly serious, but he did most painfully desire that Hans should love him for what he was, and so he sought his love, wooing him after his fashion, patiently and ardently and devotedly. It was a wooing full of anguish and sadness, and this sadness burnt deeper and sharper than any impulsive passion such as might have been expected from someone of Tonio's exotic appearance. And he wooed not entirely in vain, for Hans, who in any case respected in Tonio a certain superiority, a certain gift of speech, a talent for expressing complicated things, sensed very clearly that he had aroused in him an unusually strong and tender feeling. He was grateful for this, and responded in a way that gave Tonio much happiness, but also caused him many a pang of jealousy and disappointment in his frustrated efforts to establish intellectual companionship between them. For oddly enough, although Tonio envied Hans Hansen for being the kind of person he was, he constantly strove to entice him into being like Tonio, and the success of such attempts could at best be only momentary, and even then only apparent. "I've just been reading something wonderful, something quite splendid," he was saying. They were walking along, eating by turns out of a paper bag of fruit lozenges which they had purchased at Iverson's store in the Mühlenstrasse for 10 pfennigs. "You must read it, Hans. It's Don Carlos by Schiller, actually. I'll lend it to you if you like." "Oh, no," said Hans Hansen. "Don't bother, Tonio. That isn't my kind of thing. I'd rather stick to my horse books, you know. The illustrations in them are really marvelous. Next time you're at my house, I'll show you them. They are split-second photographs, so you can see the horses trotting and galloping and jumping and all the positions. You can never see them like that in real life because they move so fast." "In all the positions?" asked Tonio politely. "Yes, that must be nice. But as for Don Carlos, you've no idea how superb it is. You'll find such beautiful passages in it that they give you a kind of jolt. It's almost like an explosion. An explosion? Asked Hans Hansen. How do you mean? For example, the passage where the king has wept because the Marquis has betrayed him. But the Marquis, you see, has only betrayed him to help the prince. He is sacrificing himself for the prince's sake. And then word is brought from the king's study into the anteroom that the king has wept. Wept? The king wept? All the courtiers are absolutely amazed, and it pierces you through and through because he is a frightfully strict and stern king. But you can understand so well why he weeps, and actually I feel sorrier for him than for the prince and the Marquis put together. He's always so very alone, and no one loves him. And then he thinks he has found someone, and that's the very man who betrays him. Hans Hansen glanced sideways at Tonio's face, and something in it must have aroused his interest in the subject, for he suddenly linked arms with him again and asked, "Why? How does he betray him, Tonio?" Tonio's heart leapt. "Well, you see," he began, "all the dispatches for Brabant and Flanders." "Here comes Irvin Ymettal," said Hans. Tonio fell silent. If only, he thought, the earth would open and swallow that fellow Ymettal up. Why does he have to come and interrupt us? If only he doesn't join us and spend the whole walk talking about their riding lessons. For Irvin Ymettal took riding lessons too. He was the bank manager's son and lived out here beyond the city wall. He had already got rid of his satchel and was advancing toward them along the avenue with his bandy legs and slit-like eyes. "Hullo, Ymettal," said Hans. "I'm going for a bit of a walk with Kröger." "I've got to go into town and get something," said Ymettal. "But I'll walk along with you for a little way. Are those fruit lozenges you've got there?" "Yes, thanks. I'll have a couple. It's our lesson again tomorrow, Hans." He was referring to the riding lesson. "Marvelous," said Hans. "I'm going to be given my leather gaiters now, you know, because I was top in the essay the other day." "You don't take riding lessons, I suppose, Kröger?" asked Ymettal, and his eyes were just a pair of glinting slits. "No," replied Tonio in uncertain accents. Hans Hansen remarked, "You should ask your father to let you have lessons too, Kröger." "Yes," said Tonio hastily and without interest, his throat suddenly contracting because Hans had called him by his surname. Hans seemed to sense this and added by way of explanation, "I call you Kröger because you've got such a crazy first name, you know. You mustn't mind my saying so, but I really can't stand it. Tonio... Why? It isn't a name at all. Though, of course, it's not your fault. I realize that." "No, I suppose they called you that mainly because it sounds so foreign and special," said Ymettal, with an air of trying to say something nice. Tonio's mouth twitched. He pulled himself together and said, "Yes, it's a silly name. Heaven knows I'd rather it were Heinrich or Wilhelm, I can assure you. But it's all because I was christened after one of my mother's brothers whose name's Antonio. My mother comes from abroad, you know." Then he was silent and let the others talk on about horses and leather equipment. Hans had linked arms with Ymettal and was speaking with a fluent enthusiasm which Don Carlos could never have inspired in him. From time to time, Tonio felt the tears welling up inside him. His nose tingled, and his chin kept trembling so that he could hardly control it. Hans could not stand his name, and there was nothing to be done about it. His own name was Hans, and Ymettal's was Irvin, two good names which everyone recognized, to which no one could object. But Tonio was something foreign and special. Yes, he was a special case in every way, whether he liked it or not. He was isolated. He did not belong among decent, normal people, notwithstanding the fact that he was no gypsy in a green caravan, but Consul Kröger's son, a member of the Kröger family. But why did Hans always call him Tonio when they were alone together, if he felt ashamed of him as soon as anyone else appeared? Sometimes, indeed, there was a closeness between them. He was temporarily won over. "Why, how does he betray him, Tonio?" he had asked, and had taken his arm. But the moment Ymettal had turned up, he had breathed a sigh of relief nevertheless. He had dropped him and gratuitously criticized him for his foreign first name. How it hurt to have to understand all this so well. He knew that in fact Hans Hansen did like him a little, when they were by themselves, but when anyone else was there, he would feel ashamed and throw him over. Antonio would be alone again. He thought of King Philip. The king has wept. "Oh God," said Irvin Yamatal, "I really must go into town now. Goodbye, you two. Thanks for the fruit lozenges." Whereupon he jumped onto a wooden seat at the side of the avenue, ran along it with his bandy legs, and trotted away. "I like Yamatal," said Hans emphatically. Privileged as he was, he had a self-assured way of declaring his likes and dislikes, of graciously conferring them, so to speak. And then, having warmed to the theme, he went on talking about his riding lessons. In any case, they were by now quite near the Hansens' house. It did not take long to reach it by the promenade along the old fortifications. They clutched their caps and bent their heads before the wind, the strong damp breeze that moaned and jarred among the leafless branches. And Hans Hansen talked, with Tonio merely interjecting an occasional insincere "ah" or "oh yes," and getting no pleasure from the fact that Hans, in the excitement of his discourse, had again linked arms with him, for it was merely a superficial and meaningless contact. Presently, not far from the station, they turned off the promenade. They watched a train bustling and puffing past, counted the coaches just for fun, and as the last one went by, waved to the man who sat up there wrapped in his fur overcoat. Then they stopped in the Lindenplatz in front of the villa of Herr Hansen, the wholesale timber merchant, and Hans demonstrated in detail what fun it was to stand on the bottom rail of the garden gate and swing oneself to and fro on its creaking hinges. But after that, he took his leave. "Well, I must go in now," he said. "Goodbye, Tonio. Next time I'll walk you home, I promise." "Goodbye, Hans," said Tonio. It was a nice walk. Their hands, as they touched, were all wet and rusty from the garden gate. But when Hans glanced into Tonio's eyes, he seemed to recollect himself, and a look of contrition came over his handsome face. "And by the way, I'll read Don Carlos sometime soon," he said quickly. "That bit about the king in his study must be marvelous." Whereupon he hitched his satchel under his arm and ran off through the front garden. Before disappearing into the house, he turned round and nodded once more. And Tonio Kröger sped off homeward, joy lending him wings. The wind was behind him, but it was not only the wind that bore him so lightly along. Hans was going to read Don Carlos, and then they would have something in common, something they could talk about, and neither Yamatal nor anyone else would be able to join in. How well they understood each other. Perhaps, who could say, he would one day even be able to get him to write poetry, like Tonio himself. No, he didn't want that to happen. Hans must never become like Tonio, but stay as he was, with his strength and his sun-like happiness which made everyone love him, and Tonio most of all. But still, it would do him no harm to read Don Carlos. Antonio walked under the low arch of the old gate. He walked along the quayside and up the steep, damp and draughty little street with its gabled buildings, till he reached his parents' house. His heart was alive in those days. In it there was longing, and sad envy, and just a touch of contempt, and a whole world of innocent delight.